You don't always know when something ends. Sometimes you're still showing up, still going through the motions, still present in every visible way, and the thing has already been over for weeks, maybe longer. The ending didn't announce itself. It just settled, quietly, the way a tide goes out without explaining itself to the shore. What actually happened was quieter than anyone expects endings to be, and harder to name. Nobody notices when they're losing someone. That's the part nobody talks about. We spend so much time analyzing the dramatic endings, the confrontations, the ultimatums, the tears, that we completely miss the quieter process that comes before all of that. The slow, almost invisible moment when a person decides they've had enough, not of you necessarily, of what the dynamic was costing them. There's a difference, and it matters more than most people are willing to sit with. Someone was in a relationship once, work, romantic, doesn't matter, where they gave everything they had for a long time, showed up consistently, adjusted, bent in directions that didn't feel natural just to keep things smooth. And one day, without a dramatic announcement, without a single argument that could serve as a clean explanation later, they just stopped. Stopped reaching, stopped explaining themselves, stopped trying to be understood. They didn't leave the room, they left something else, something more central than physical proximity. And the other person, the one who had grown used to the reaching, the explaining, the availability, didn't notice for weeks, maybe longer. By the time they noticed, the distance was no longer crossable in a conversation. What shifted wasn't dramatic. That's the thing that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it from the inside. It wasn't a decision made in fury. It was more like a settling, like something that had been slightly off balance for too long finally found its actual center of gravity. And once you find that, once you feel what it's like to be genuinely rooted in yourself again, going back to the imbalance isn't something your body will allow. Not because you've become cold, because you've become honest. There's something in Seneca's letters that captures this without being dramatic about it. The idea that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Yes, but also that we often endure things in reality that we should have ended in thought long before. The endurance isn't always nobility. Sometimes it's just habit, confusion, the accumulated weight of not wanting to be the one who gave up. But giving up and stepping back aren't the same thing. Most people collapse those two into one and use them interchangeably, which is how they end up staying in things that have already ended, waiting for a moment that already passed. The silence that breaks people open isn't caused by cruelty. It's caused by clarity. And you can't fake your way to that clarity. You arrive at it, slowly, sometimes painfully, through a series of moments that teach you, one by one, what you actually are when no one's watching you perform. That's where this begins. From the outside, it looked like nothing. That's the part that catches people off guard later, how unremarkable the beginning of it was. Someone stops responding as quickly. They're still there, still present in the technical sense, still showing up to the places they're supposed to show up to. But something in the texture of their presence has changed. You couldn't point to it in a court of law. You couldn't build a case around it. It's more like the difference between someone standing in a room because they want to be there and someone standing in a room because leaving would require an explanation. They don't have the energy to give. The people around them notice nothing. And why would they? Nothing happened. No event, no confrontation, no announcement. A person at work gets slightly quieter in meetings, not dramatically, just a degree or two, and their colleagues assume it's stress or a bad week or something at home. A person in a relationship stops initiating conversations about the future, not abruptly, just gradually, and their partner figures they're tired, figures things will return to normal, figures this is just a phase that every long relationship moves through. A person in a friendship starts letting more calls go to voicemail. They call back. They're friendly when they call back. They're just a few degrees less available than they used to be. Nobody reads the shift because the shift doesn't look like a shift. It looks like weather, something passing through. There's a version of this I've seen in professional settings specifically. Someone who was once the first to volunteer, the first to stay late, the first to absorb extra responsibility. They're still doing those things, but the quality underneath has changed. They used to bring a kind of steadiness to the room. That steadiness was visible, almost tangible, the way a grounded person can make an entire meeting feel less chaotic without saying a single word about it. And then one day it's still there on the surface, but the roots of it are gone. The behavior continues, the investment doesn't. People around them don't notice because they were consuming the output, not watching the source. And the person pulling back, they're often not even fully conscious of what they're doing. It's not strategy. It's not a plan. It's the body finding its own way towards something more anchored before the mind has fully agreed to the direction. The behavior changes first. The understanding comes later, sometimes much later, sometimes only in retrospect. Someone asks what happened, and they realize they can't point to a day or a moment. There wasn't one. There was a slow gravitational pull towards somewhere more stable, and they followed it without a map. From the outside, nothing happened. From the inside, everything already had. The thing about erosion is that it doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up one morning and find a canyon where a field used to be. You find dust, small amounts of dust, accumulating in places you stopped looking. What was happening underneath wasn't dramatic. It was a series of moments so individually minor that naming any single one of them out loud would have felt disproportionate. Petty, even. Someone says something dismissive in a tone that's just slightly off, and you absorb it. You don't make a scene. You're a reasonable person. You understand that people have bad days, that context matters, that not every careless word is a window into someone's true feelings about you. So you let it pass. You file it somewhere in the back, not consciously, just somewhere. And then another one comes, and another. And the filing system starts to get crowded. This is the part that's genuinely hard to explain. I'm not sure I have the right words for it even now. From the outside it looked like nothing was said, nothing was addressed, and therefore nothing was wrong. But the body keeps a different kind of record than the mind does. The mind negotiates, rationalizes, finds charitable interpretations. The body just registers. It registers the moment you said something vulnerable, and the response was distracted. It registers the time you asked for something specific, and were given something adjacent, something close enough that you couldn't technically complain, but far enough from what you actually needed that the distance was felt. It registers the pattern of your own accommodation. How many times you bent, how many times you adjusted your expectations downward without telling anyone, including yourself, that you were doing it. There's a particular kind of relationship where this builds fastest. Not the obviously difficult ones, not the ones where the problem is clear and nameable, the ones where things are fine, where everything is technically fine, where if someone asked you to explain why you felt hollowed out, you would struggle to build a coherent argument because each individual piece is too small to carry the weight of what you're feeling. A family dynamic where one person consistently redirects every conversation back to themselves, not cruelly, just habitually, and the other person stops bringing things to that space. Experience has taught them, what you bring there, you carry back out alone. They don't announce this. They don't even fully decide it. They just stop going to a well that keeps coming up dry. What erodes isn't always love. Sometimes it's something more structural than that. It's the belief that you are seen, the quiet assumption which you maybe didn't even know you were making, that the other person was paying attention to the same reality you were living in. When that assumption gets disproved enough times, not shattered, just disproved, quietly, repeatedly, something in you recalibrates. The warmth doesn't necessarily disappear. The investment does. And here's the part that almost nobody accounts for. The person pulling back is often still trying, still showing up, still doing the visible things that look like presence, but they've stopped doing the invisible thing, which is making themselves available at the level where it actually costs something. They've stopped offering the part of themselves that could be genuinely hurt. And since most people only measure presence by its surface indicators, are you here? Are you responding? Are you performing the expected gestures? Nobody notices that the most essential thing has quietly been withdrawn and placed somewhere safer. Seneca wrote that we should periodically examine what we've been tolerating, not to assign blame, but to understand what our tolerance has been teaching us about what we believe we deserve. That's not a comfortable exercise. People avoid it for years, but the body doesn't wait for permission to start drawing its own conclusions. Long before the conscious mind catches up, something deeper is already making adjustments, already pulling back from the edge, already finding its way to something more rooted, even if the path there is invisible to everyone watching from the outside. The erosion doesn't start with a wound, it starts with a question that never gets asked out loud. And it ends, not with an answer, but with the quiet decision that the asking isn't worth it anymore. The other person noticed something, just not the right thing. They noticed the temperature drop. They noticed fewer messages, shorter answers, a certain quality of absence that hadn't been there before. And because humans are meaning-making creatures who cannot tolerate an unexplained shift, they immediately started constructing an explanation. The explanation, almost without exception, was about themselves. Or, well, sometimes it was narcissistic, honestly, but mostly just human. Something changed in this person's behavior toward me, therefore something I did caused it, which sounds like accountability, but is actually just another form of centering yourself in someone else's story. So they ran through the inventory. The last conversation, was there something said wrong? The last few weeks, was there a moment of carelessness that registered as something larger? They started auditing their own behavior, which would be admirable, except that they were auditing for the wrong things. They were looking for an event, a specific incident they could locate and apologize for and resolve. What they weren't equipped to look for was the pattern, the cumulative weight of 100 small moments. That kind of accounting requires a different kind of attention than most people have been taught to practice. In friendship specifically, this reads in a particular way. One person starts being less available, and the other starts performing more effort, more warmth, more reaching, as if the solution to someone quietly stepping back is to step forward harder, and sometimes that works in the short term. The person who was pulling back gets pulled back in by the sudden warmth, by the feeling of being wanted, by the gravitational pull of familiarity, but nothing underneath has changed. The dynamic is identical. The only thing that shifted was the volume of the performance, and that can only sustain itself for so long before the original reasons for withdrawing reassert themselves. The story the other person built was almost always simpler than the reality, cleaner, more resolvable, because the real story, that they had been slowly, unconsciously consuming someone's steadiness without ever truly seeing it, that story required them to look at themselves in a way that was genuinely uncomfortable. And given the choice between a comfortable explanation and an accurate one, people reach for comfort first and call it understanding. But here's what neither of them could see. And this is the part that matters more than the rest of it combined. The dynamic between them had its own gravity. Not the gravity of one person pulling the other down, something subtler than that. More like a field they'd built together over time, one they'd grown so accustomed to inhabiting that they'd stopped noticing it was a construction at all. They thought they were just relating to each other. They didn't see that they were relating to a pattern, a set of roles that had calcified so slowly over so many small moments that by the time you could name them, they felt like personality traits, like fixed facts, like this is just who these two people are together. One person had become the one who absorbs, the one who adjusts, the one whose backbone was treated as infrastructure, useful, load-bearing, invisible. Nobody decided this consciously. It worked, and that was enough. Because every time they absorbed and adjusted and held firm without complaint, the system functioned smoothly, and smooth systems don't get examined. You examine what breaks. You take for granted what holds. The other person had become the one who receives that steadiness without accounting for it. Not maliciously. This is the part I want to be careful about, because it's easy to make this into a story of a villain and a victim, and that's almost never what it actually is. The person receiving the steadiness wasn't extracting it deliberately. They were just living inside a dynamic that had quietly trained them to expect a certain kind of availability, a certain quality of anchoring. Nobody ever required them to acknowledge it was being offered. That's how invisible labor works in any relationship. Once it's consistent enough, it becomes ambient, part of the furniture. The room feels off when it's gone, but nobody can name what changed. Think about a long-term working relationship. Two people who've been collaborating for years. One of them has always been the one who smooths the friction, who notices the tension before it becomes conflict, who does the relational maintenance that keeps things functional. The other person is genuinely talented, genuinely present in their own way, but has never had to develop that particular set of capacities because someone else was always already doing it. And neither of them has ever talked about this. Why would they? Things are working. Things have always worked. The conversation about how things are working, and at whose expense, never becomes necessary until suddenly the one doing the maintenance quietly stops. What neither of them saw was that the maintenance itself had become a cage. No one constructed it deliberately. The person maintaining things had simply taught everyone around them, through years of consistent behavior, that they were infinitely available for that role. And once you teach people something through behavior, words alone rarely undo it. You can say I need things to be different and mean it completely, and still find that the dynamic reasserts itself within days because it's structural now, not interpersonal. It lives in the architecture of how you two move around each other, not in either person's intentions. The blind spot was this: the person withdrawing thought they were leaving a relationship. The person being left thought they were losing a person. Neither of them understood that what was actually ending was a system, a way of organizing themselves around each other that had served certain needs while quietly violating others. And systems, unlike people, can't be apologized to, can't be won back with a better conversation or a more sincere gesture. They either get redesigned from the ground up, with both people genuinely willing to see what they were participating in, or they collapse. And most of the time, not always, but most of the time, by the time one person has started pulling back this thoroughly, the appetite for that redesign is already gone. Not out of stubbornness, out of exhaustion, out of the particular kind of tiredness that comes from having already tried, in smaller ways, for longer than anyone on the outside knows. The thing neither of them could see was the thing that was most true, which is usually how it goes. There was no argument. That's the first thing to understand, and it's the thing that confuses people most when they try to reconstruct what happened afterward. There was a moment, ordinary in every visible respect, the kind of moment that, if you described it to someone else, they would look at you with genuine confusion and say, "That doesn't sound like much." And they'd be right. It didn't sound like much. It wasn't much, measured by any external standard. Someone said something offhand, or didn't say something that the moment was quietly asking for, or responded to something real with something rehearsed, something that had the shape of engagement without the substance of it. And the person on the receiving end of that non-moment felt something shift. Not break, shift. There's a difference that's worth sitting with. Breaking implies violence, implies sound, implies that something whole became something fractured in a way that's visible to anyone nearby. What actually happens is quieter and in some ways more permanent. It's more like a door that was always slightly open, not wide open, not inviting, just not fully closed, and then it closes. Not slammed, just closed, with a soft sound that nobody else in the room hears. Someone in a long relationship described it once in a way that stayed with me. They said there was an evening where their partner was telling a story to friends, a story that touched on something the two of them had talked about privately, something that had been shared in a moment of real vulnerability, and the partner used it as material. Not cruelly, casually, just folded it into the narrative of the evening without a second thought. And the person sitting across the table watched it happen and felt something go very still inside them. Not angry, not hurt exactly, just still, like a part of them that had been slightly in motion for years simply stopped moving. And they smiled at the right moments for the rest of the evening, and they went home, and they never brought it up. But something had been decided in that stillness that no subsequent conversation was ever going to undecide. That's what the moment looks like, unremarkable from the outside, irreversible from the inside. What makes it irreversible isn't the event itself, it's what the event confirms. Every one of these moments carries evidential weight, not as a standalone incident, but as the latest data point in a pattern the body has been tracking for much longer than the conscious mind admitted. And when a moment lands that way, as confirmation rather than surprise, something releases. There's sometimes a trace of relief in it, yes, but mostly it's something else, a tension that had been maintained through effort, simply stopping. The effort required to believe things might be different evaporates, and once that particular effort is gone, it doesn't come back. Not because the person is unforgiving, but because they're finally, after a long time, being honest with themselves about what the evidence has been showing them. The thread didn't snap. It finished, and there's a kind of gravity in that distinction that most people never fully reckon with until they're standing on one side of it, looking at the space where something used to be. And then the silence settled in, permanently, and what it revealed about each of them was not what either of them expected. The person who had withdrawn found something on the other side that surprised them. Happiness wasn't the first thing that would be too simple and too fast. And anyone who tells you the peace comes quickly after a long entanglement is either lying or describing a different kind of situation than this one. What came first was space, just space. The particular quality of a morning where you wake up and nothing is pulling at you from a direction you'd stopped believing in. The steadiness that had always been there, underneath the accommodation and the adjustment and the performance of availability, finally had room to just exist without being immediately consumed by something external. That felt at first almost disorienting. Then it felt like something closer to being rooted in actual ground rather than in the idea of ground. The other person came apart in ways they hadn't predicted. Not dramatically, not all at once, more like a structure that had been leaning on something for support, discovering, only after that support was gone, how much of its own weight it had never learned to carry. They reached out. They tried to reconstruct the connection through effort, through the kind of sudden attentiveness that had been absent for years. And the reaching was real. The remorse, to whatever degree it existed, was probably real too. But it was arriving after the door had already closed, and sincerity delivered too late has a particular quality to it. You can feel the genuineness of it and still understand, without cruelty, that it doesn't change anything structural. What the silence revealed in the end was simply who each of them had always been. The withdrawal didn't create new people. It removed the conditions that had been obscuring them. This case isn't unusual. That's the uncomfortable part. The specific details change. The setting, the relationship type, the particular flavor of the dynamic, but the underlying architecture repeats itself with a consistency that once you see it, you start recognizing everywhere. In the colleague who slowly stops contributing ideas to a team that kept taking credit for them without acknowledgement. In the parent who gradually withdraws emotional availability from a grown child who only calls when they need something. In the person who, after years of being the one who remembers, who organizes, who holds the relational threads together, quietly puts those threads down one day and waits to see if anyone notices. Some do, most don't. Not until the absence has a weight that can no longer be explained away as a phase. The pattern is always the same at its core. Someone with genuine backbone, not performance, not posturing, actual internal structure, enters a dynamic and makes themselves available in ways that are real and costly. The cost is invisible because they carry it without complaint, which is both their integrity and for a long time their blind spot. The other party receives that availability, and through no particular fault of their own, begins to organize their expectations around it. The availability becomes assumed. The assumption becomes the foundation. And foundations by definition go unexamined until they crack. What this single case exposes is that the crisis point, the silence, the withdrawal, the moment someone realizes they've lost something they didn't know they were losing, is never actually about that moment. It's the visible surface of something that was built over a long period by both people, through 1,000 small choices, most of which felt completely reasonable at the time. And here's the part that genuinely unsettles people when they sit with it. The person who withdraws is not the one who ended things. Things ended much earlier. What the withdrawal does is simply make visible an ending that had already occurred at a level neither person had been willing to name out loud. The silence doesn't create the loss. It confirms it. There's a significant difference between those two things, and collapsing them together is how people end up spending months trying to repair something that would need to be entirely rebuilt, not repaired, to function differently. The pattern reveals something about attention, about the particular kind of attention that most people are never taught to practice, not the reactive kind, not the kind that activates when something is visibly wrong, but the kind that notices what's quietly right and understands that quietly right things require tending. That the person in your life who is grounded and steady and absorbs difficulty without making it your problem is not self-sufficient in the way their behavior might suggest. They're choosing repeatedly to metabolize things alone, and that choice has a cost that doesn't show on the surface but accumulates somewhere real. The question this pattern puts to anyone willing to ask it honestly is not who was wrong. It's what were you actually paying attention to and what were you treating as furniture. Because most of what we lose in this life, we lose not through dramatic failure, but through the slow accumulation of insufficient attention, through the quiet assumption that what holds will continue to hold without ever being seen, acknowledged, or offered anything in return. The case is one. The pattern is everywhere, and the only exit from it is a kind of attention that most people find genuinely difficult. The difficulty isn't a question of capacity. It's that this kind of attention requires looking at what you've been taking for granted and sitting with what you find there without immediately reaching for an excuse. There's a question underneath everything that was said here, and it's not about the person who withdrew or the person who was left standing in the silence trying to understand what happened. Those are just the two visible figures in a story that's really about something else entirely. The question is about attention, specifically the quality of attention you've been bringing to the people in your life who hold things together quietly. The ones whose steadiness you've been breathing like air, present, necessary, completely unremarked upon until the moment it isn't there anymore. And the question isn't comfortable, which is probably why most people deflect it into analysis of the other person rather than sitting with what it's actually asking. What would you find if you looked honestly at the relationships you're currently inside? Not the dramatic ones, not the ones with visible friction that you're already aware of and already managing. The stable ones, the ones that function. What is the actual cost of that functioning, and who is paying it? And have you ever once acknowledged that out loud? I'm not certain everyone who watches this will recognize themselves in the person who withdrew. Some will. Some will recognize themselves in the other role, and that recognition will be uncomfortable in a different way. Not the discomfort of having been unseen, but the discomfort of understanding that you may have been doing the consuming without ever examining the transaction. Both recognitions are useful. Neither one is a verdict. What the pattern keeps revealing, across every variation of it, is that the people most worth keeping are often the ones least likely to announce their own value. They're anchored enough not to need the announcement. And that anchoring, that quality of being genuinely rooted in themselves rather than performing stability for external approval, can be mistaken for inexhaustibility, for not needing anything in return, for being fine. They're not always fine. They're often just quiet about it, which is a form of dignity that gets exploited more than it gets honored. So the thing to take from this isn't a technique. It isn't a list of behaviors to audit or correct. It's simpler and harder than that. It's the practice of looking at what holds your life together and asking whether you've been treating it as infrastructure or as something alive, something that requires being seen. Something that, if ignored long enough, will find its own gravity and move towards somewhere it can finally exist without disappearing into the background of your inattention. The silence that breaks people open isn't punishment. It's just the sound of something real finally being honest about what it needs. Subscribe if you want more of this. Like if something landed, the hype button shows up after worth clicking.